Good morning. So I want to express first appreciation to Director Thomas Martinek and to the Research Director, Eli Heikkila, for the invitation and the arrangements. I'm very pleased to be able to be here and to join with members of the Migration Institute of Finland to consider the history of migration in broad scope. By broad scope, I mean that the study of migration goes back to the earliest times, to the traditions and myths of origin of each people. But migration is also a recent discipline, as scholars began to study European urbanization and overseas migration in the 19th century. Today, with the expansion of social sciences, humanities, and natural science disciplines, we can explore the whole of the human experience through study of migration, reaching across time and space. The topics in my presentation will include a qualitative discussion of the main flows of human migration, the identification of shifting social structures as they related to migration, and some suggestions on how best to categorize, quantify, and analyze flows of migration over the long term. So I begin with Homo erectus, an early ancestor of humanity who existed from 2 million years ago to 500,000 years ago. This species is known from skulls and skeletons and characteristic Acheulean hand axes in Africa, in Europe, in Southern Asia, and as far as Java and Beijing. Its body was hardly distinguishable from our own. Its brain size was 900 cubic centimeters, so some 2/3 that of humans today. Its teeth were larger than ours. The world of Homo erectus was one of climate fluctuation. The Earth has undergone several million years of cycles of just over 100,000 years, with long periods of cooling, ending in great expanses of glaciation, followed by short periods of rapid warming. The temperature fluctuations were on the order of 10 degrees centigrade from top to bottom. So here's the 10 degrees, and here's the temperature, cycles in temperature. These climate cycles resulted especially from varying intensity of solar energy as Earth's orbit varied. Reinforcing temperature change were parallel fluctuations in atmospheric concentration of two greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide at the top of the graph and methane at the bottom of the graph. Note that after the low point of each glacial maximum, temperature rose rapidly to a peak and quickly declined. So this is the rapid increase. And this is, right here, this time is the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago. The research confirming this picture of Earth's past has been completed since 1950. Homo erectus, meanwhile, survived, expanded, and declined in response to fluctuating climate, giving way to succeeding species. Neanderthals and then Homo heidelbergensis became known in Europe from the 19th century as the field of paleontology developed, and only in the 21st century did a fuller chronology become clear. Heidelbergensis is now known to have arisen some 600,000 years ago and then gave rise to three main groups. Neanderthals from over 400,000 years ago in Europe and West Asia, Denisovans in Eastern and Southern Asia somewhat later, and Homo sapiens in Africa by 300,000 years ago. Genetic analysis developed by stages in the late 20th century. The 1980s analysis of mitochondria, tracing female ancestry, showed that Homo sapiens arose in Africa before 200,000 years ago. Then came Y chromosome analysis, tracing male ancestry, and whole genome analysis, focusing on ancient DNA recovered through archaeology. Beyond paleontology and genetics, a new field of cultural evolution focused on Homo sapiens and its processes of learning. Learning as exchanged and recorded in the brain, mixed with genetic tendencies towards collaboration. Parallel research in cultural evolution traced group size, gestures for communication, elements of language, and the nature of emotions. In some, these showed unexpected skills and changes in the ancestors of modern humans. A bigger change was the rise of spoken language, some 70,000 years ago. Its origin is not confirmed in detail, but the importance of language in human society is such that we need to debate explicit alternatives about when and how speech arose. I argue that syntactical language began in the interaction of children, expanding and forming communities of discourse. It took extraordinary effort to learn language, committing individuals to the community of speakers. Languages, once created, changed inherently through use in their lexicon, their syntax, and phonology. A community of about 150 speakers became necessary to sustain the vocabulary and especially the syntax of a language. This community became the first social institution. With such communities, speaking humans were formidable in comparison to others. Communities grew through birth and by incorporating non-speakers until they divided. Languages diverged, but the separated communities remained in contact, especially through exchange of young migrants who had to learn new language and customs as they moved. The exchange of young migrants across communities, as I call it, cross-community migration, permitted exchange of knowledge, genetic exchange, and built networks linking communities through speech that created a broader human system. The language groups of today retain traces of the original language groups of early humans. Language distributions, reinforced by archaeology and genetics, identify northeastern Africa as the homeland of speaking humans. The Khoisan languages in southern and eastern Africa, from this group down further to the south, preserve traces of early settlers. In the homeland and elsewhere within Africa, but also in Asia, speaking Homo sapiens communities encountered those who did not speak. From genetic evidence, we know that there was interbreeding among communities. This tendency to interbreed can be seen as an inherent human quality, a migratory instinct within humans. But since there's a debate about whether the capacity to speak was limited to those who had inherited certain genes, there is question as to whether those in other communities could learn to speak, or whether they were incorporated into the human community as subordinates. Yet it seems clear that some who joined the community did learn to speak. Therefore, we can be sure that in addition to native speakers of the original language, there were always those who learned language late in life and who therefore had thick accents, weak syntax, or who spoke Creole and Pidgin versions of language. Speaking humans occupied most of the old world tropics by 45,000 years ago. Geneticists now argue that there was a single migration from Africa to Asia, and that all populations outside of Africa descend from this initial migration. By the same logic, a single African language was ancestral to all the languages spoken outside the continent. Nilo-Saharan languages spoken in Africa are of particular interest, as they may be seen as descended within Africa from the languages that also moved with settlers eastward along the Indian Ocean coast after crossing the Bab el-Mandeb by boats that were most likely of reeds bound together by twine. Tracing surviving language groups, and the dots mark the homelands of the main language groups that one can see today along the Asian tropics. These showed that for the populations moving across the consistent ecology of the Indian Ocean littoral, reached what are now Australia and New Guinea by 50,000 years ago. Boats were necessary to cross stretches of 60 to 100 kilometers of open water, especially to get from here to here or over to Australia. Presumably, boats had been relied upon for the whole trip east. That's going to happen more. Early migrants who lived as foragers made modest advances in their technology. More important were the new ideas and representations of the world that they developed through discourse and reflection. For the time after 50,000 years ago, we have records of extraordinary visual representations by the inhabitants of most regions of the world. Cave paintings in Europe, Southeast Asia, and India, rock paintings in Africa and Australia, ivory sculptures in Siberia. Such representations were unique to humans, nobody else made them, but universal among speaking humans. Here's a favorite of mine, a woman with a stone axe from northern Australia, created some 20,000 years ago. The next migration from the tropics was to the north into temperate Eurasia, but it was no easy matter. The era from 50,000 to 40,000 years ago was exceptionally cold and dry, so that the Sahara, Arabia, and regions north of them, that is, regions north of the fertile tropics, were virtually impassable. This figure shows the periodic fluctuations in the force of insolation, alternating between greenery, so that's what this threshold value is. Above it, the Sahara, for instance, could be green and grassy, and below it was desert. And so I've marked here the time for the rise of speech, 70,000 years ago, the time that we're talking about for the occupying of the temperate zone, the time of the last glacial maximum, and we will get to the Younger Dryas and the beginning of the Holocene era. As warmth and humidity began to return 45,000 years ago, the easiest route north was along the foothills, just west of the Himalayas. North, therefore, of Pakistan and the Indus Valley. Climate, flora, and fauna were greatly different from the tropical littoral of the Indian Ocean. But migrants who reached the grassy steppes, once they adjusted to its habitat, found ample game for hunting, plus temperate fruits and vegetables. Language evidence suggests the North Caucasus as a key region of settlement to the west. From this region, migrants moved to the Black Sea and to the Mediterranean and to the Danube Valley. These settlers, known as Cro-Magnons in the terminology of early paleontologists, arrived in roughly 45,000 years ago. At much the same time, migrants also moved eastward along the steppes. Main center to the east appears to have been the forested Amur Valley, I've marked here, from which Eurasiatic languages rose roughly 30,000 years ago. This is the full extent of the Eurasiatic languages. They moved steadily west, but also moved north and south and to the east. That's, yes. The recurring decline in temperature reached its extreme by 21,500 years ago, by which time great glacial sheets had spread over polar regions. Yet in this era, inhabitants persisted in northeast Siberia, and some of them moved into Beringia, the lowland that was revealed by the low level of the ocean between Siberia and Alaska. The last glacial maximum caused all species to retreat, seeking lower latitudes and lower altitudes. Humans too moved and sought new arrangements. Two main types of social change occurred in this era. First was the development of productive techniques, construction of shelter, creation of textiles, intensive gathering of grains and other vegetable materials, and organization of workshops to rely on collaboration in production. Second was the creation of confederations, as community groups joined together to coordinate their new and more complex activities. An example of expanded human skills was the rapid occupation of the Americas. Despite the great Laurentide ice sheet separating North American and Asian lands, two groups of settlers were able to make maritime voyages to reach the Americas. Voyagers from northeastern Asia, from someplace in this area here, moved along what is called now the Kelp Highway. In any case, there was food out there in the edge of the ocean, and settled in these areas that I'll now look at in a little more detail. So the Kelp Highway was an offshore collection of kelp, seaweed, fish, birds, maritime mammals that provided food for those who were traveling. The initial group settled in the Salish Sea. It's the term that's used for what's now Seattle and Vancouver, and is the center for the mating and reproduction of the salmon population for the North Pacific. In this homeland, just past the ice, the glaciation, the Amerindian languages took form. While some settlers moved rapidly inland to settle North America, others moved even more rapidly along the Pacific coast, forming settlements and Amerindian language subgroups in what are now California, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, reaching the settlement now known as Monteverde, that is, in what is now estimated at 18,500 years ago. Genetic and linguistic data now confirm each other. So this map comes from a genetics article showing that the subdivisions in the populations, basically a northern and a great southern group, are very parallel according to linguistic and genetic evidence. A second group of migrants also relying on the Kelp Highway from Asia and now known as speakers of Na-Dene languages, arrived later, settling roughly 17,000 years ago on the island of Haida Gwaii. So this is that island. It was the first island in this whole area to be free of ice. The settlers gradually moved to nearby areas as the ice receded. This is my view of Pleistocene history. Have I been convincing that spoken language appeared rather suddenly some 70,000 years ago? We see sudden expansion of communities large enough to sustain spoken language, settling huge terrains with widely varying habitats, advancing their technology, and especially their representation, doubtless articulating philosophy, all in the course of 50,000 years. If more proof of the rapid emergence of language is needed, we nonetheless have a strong argument. The Holocene epoch, most of the last 11 to 12,000 years, was a time of new types of human expansion. Not just new lands, but new intensity in exploiting lands. But first, the transition from Pleistocene to Holocene brought a geologic moment of particular interest, known as the Younger Dryas, and named after the flowers that thrived during its cold spell. This was a period of sudden and severe cold from 12,600 to 11,500 years ago. Temperatures declined within a decade by 10 degrees. That's temperatures for the Earth overall. At one point, and then 1,000 years later, rose again within a decade by 10 degrees. Maybe the event resulted from shifts in glaciers and oceanic currents along with warming. Maybe it was the result of an extraterrestrial impact, of which we have a candidate in the Greenland crater that's been recently discovered, though not yet dated. The same moment brought extinction of the megafauna of the Americas, including the elimination of the last of North American horses. In the longer term, the millennia of overall warming in late Pleistocene and early Holocene epochs encouraged migration to new lands, as well as settling to develop agriculture. In West Asia, speakers of Afroasiatic languages moved from the Nile Valley to all of northern Africa, the Levant, and Arabia. In East Asia, speakers of Chinese languages moved from Southwest Highlands to the northeast of today's China. As the Holocene proceeded, agriculture developed, expanded in Asia, New Guinea, Africa, South America, and then spread within those regions. Initial crops included wheat, barley, rice, millet, sorghum, sheep, cattle, sorghum, taro, and yams. That's the vegetable part. And then the initial domesticated animals included donkeys, goats, sheep, cattle, pigs, and chicken. And then the horses and camels came later. Agriculture was facilitated by earlier experiments with intensive gathering of grain, replanting of tubers, and by an expanded social order. Societies of 1,000 or more members formed in this era through consolidation of 6 or more of the initial language communities of 150. These Holocene societies had expanded language groups, growing diversity and division of labor, yet shared an identity that we can call ethnic. As agriculture and animal husbandry expanded, they influenced the environment in ways that we are only now recognizing, especially through the multi-pronged argument of the geologist William Redeman. Redeman began by noting that the post-Ice Age peak in temperature, 10,000 years ago, should, as in previous cases, have been followed by a decline in atmospheric carbon dioxide and temperature. But this time, the decline in carbon dioxide reversed and began a rapid rise. So this is the blue envelope is the average of previous temperatures and also the average of previous concentrations of carbon dioxide. And this is what happened the last time with 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. Carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere increasing. The explanation that Rudiman offers is that clearing of forest and brush for farming in many parts of the world reduced the absorption of carbon dioxide by plant life and also increased Earth's reflectivity. Both of these caused atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration to increase, preventing solar energy from escaping the Earth. Was this effect large enough to impact temperature? Rudiman had to show that early farmers, though small in number, were not efficient in their use of land, and so that they cleared huge amounts of land, thus enabling the carbon dioxide concentrations to increase. In parallel, methane gas is even more efficient in increasing temperature. Methane concentration initially declining according to the previous patterns, and this time I showed all the individual variations of previous cycles, but you can see that the methane, the red dots, declining as they're supposed to for a while at about 5,000 or 4,000 years ago, began quite a rapid increase. The explanation was that growing numbers of oxen, cattle, and water buffalo, now domesticated and pulling plows in farming, and the rise of equine culture 4,000 years ago, generated methane from animals' flatulence after consuming grasses, which then expanded atmospheric methane. The overall result was that Earth's natural temperature declined and human creation of greenhouse gases canceled each other out. So that Holocene era temperature from 7,000 years ago yielded a stability that was virtually unprecedented in climate history and enabled human society and economy to expand and evolve dramatically. This worldwide expansion of agriculture in an era of climate stability was also the era of early cities in Mesopotamia, the Nile, and the Yellow River Valley. Technical and social innovations in this time brought metals, water supplies, literacy, and at the same time, outside the river valleys, Indo-European speakers settled and opened farms in Europe and South Asia, as did Austronesians moving into islands, Southeast Asia, and Bantu speakers moving from West Africa to occupy the southern third of Africa, and other such migrations, including in the Americas. At a later stage, from 500 BCE, the Achaemenids in Persia launched a 2,500-year long era of empires, which lasted until empires stopped at the end of the last century. Rather than tarry with the classical era, I choose to move rapidly to the most recent millennium, the time since 1000 CE. This terminal Holocene epoch was a time of concentrated change in human society and in the natural environment. I call it the era of collisions, referring at once to collisions within human society and collisions between humanity and the natural world. This era began with a period of steady warming from as early as 700 CE and continuing to 1250 CE. These figures here these are actually carbon dioxide figures, again from Rudiman, but the changes in carbon dioxide do indicate the steady growth in temperature and really in rainfall at that time. Such warming is well documented for Europe, but also confirmed for other parts of the world. Population and agricultural output rose. Along with them rose ambition, warfare, and casualties. Examples on every continent: document this as an era of war and successive conquests by empires, alternating with commercial expansion. The Mongol state, exploding from 1200 CE, became the extreme example of conquests in response to new opportunities. Then, after 150 years of Mongol conquest and widespread empire, epidemic disease spread even further. Bubonic plague, perhaps facilitated by increased contact within the Mongol Empire, spread from the 1340s through Asia and Europe, causing commerce, empire, and population to decline. New work by Monica Green and others indicates that Africa too suffered from plague and population decline at a similar, slightly later time, along with India. Ruderman argues that these episodes show how changes in human society can reduce as well as increase temperature. Declining population meant less farming, the fields became overgrown, and herds of animals declined, so carbon dioxide and methane emissions declined, resulting in temperature reduction. And then from the 16th century, once transatlantic communications were opened up, Old World diseases caused American populations to decline sharply, harming agricultural output. New techniques in genetic analysis confirm a population decline of roughly 50% for the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries. This Columbian exchange may also have led to disease and population decline in the Eastern Hemisphere that has not otherwise been accounted for. But an example is the spread of syphilis in this period. The impact of population decline was global, as the decline in agriculture reduced the temperature. The Little Ice Age, a 3-century decline in temperature, reached its low point in the mid-17th century, thus responding in part to changes in human society. Yet the impulse for commerce and empire persisted and recurred. Global commerce expanded, though with fluctuations, from the 11th and 12th centuries on into the era of global maritime connections after 1500. For labor to support expanding commerce, merchants turned especially to enslavement. From the mid-17th to the mid-19th century, the principal flow of international migrants was that of African captives, carried across the Atlantic to the Americas, but also to the Mediterranean and to the Indian Ocean. Atlantic flow reached 100,000 captive voyages per year. As I will show, this migration can be analyzed in the framework of cross-community migration. As people from around the world encountered each other more regularly, new hierarchies and new prejudices arose. With slave labor recruitment, racial categorization and racial discrimination became a part of what marked the difference between migrants of high status and migrants who were subordinated. Such hierarchy is not unrelated to today's emphasis on rejection and subordination of so many immigrants. For the period since 1500 CE, and really 1500 to 1800, here, scholars Jan and Leo Lucassen have developed a new framework for accounting of migration. They apply it to large and literate cultural or political units. Focusing initially on Europe, especially European Russia, they tallied 6 types of migration. Before 1800, they found the largest category of internal migration to be temporal multi-annual migration. And here we get a look at the Lucassen's analysis. These are 50-year periods. This is temporal multi-annual migration, which consists of the recruitment of soldiers sailors and artisans within Europe. The numbers of immigrants are much smaller down here. We're higher at a slightly earlier time. And I'll just stop there. Okay, so their system tallies, in addition to temporal multi-annual migrant of these recruits, they tallied seasonal migration, urbanization, and rural resettlement, all of that within the European unit that they're analyzing. And then for external migration, they tally immigration to Europe, which was tiny in this time, and emigration from Europe, which was larger than immigration, but was smaller, as I've said, than the contemporary forced migration of Africans. The Lucasons calculate a cross-cultural migration rate. That's the height of these bars, summing migration for 50-year periods and taking it as a percentage of mid-period population for each period. Parallel work on China, Japan, and India showed some similarity in migration patterns for this time period. My narrative now enters the Anthropocene epoch, the time when human society accelerated its own transformations and became the principal influence on the natural ecology. Scale expanded dramatically. It's not just that there have been more of us since 1800, but that we live in groups of growing size. Language groups expanded from several thousand up to 1 million and beyond. While we have no statistics, it appears that from the 15th to the 20th century, certain language communities grew at the expense of others, so that perhaps for the first time there were social groups of 1 million, and now several million, speaking virtually the same language. School systems expanded common speech. The biggest changes in forming large language communities came during the Anthropocene, especially in the 20th century, when electronic communication expanded. A complex and associated issue is the loss of many languages and dialects in the formation of these huge language communities. The Anthropocene also brought industrialization, first to the North Atlantic, and it brought civilizational hierarchy by race, religion, economic role, as well as capitalist economic structures bound by empire at home and abroad. Coal was essential to developing steam power, but petroleum burning, beginning in 1860, became globally dominant before 1900. Industry and commerce had complex effects on migration. Captives were transported across the oceans or by land in the United States, Cuba, and Brazil. Slavery expanded within Africa and Asia until the 1870s, and then declined. Irish migration exploded with the famine of the 1840s, and other flows followed. These migrations took place in the era of free trade, in which great powers allowed no restrictions on trade. In this sense, humans on the move were regarded as commodities that could be settled wherever there was a market for them. Indentured laborers, too, moved to the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Historian Adam McEwen showed that the century of international migration starting in the 1840s was not only transatlantic. McEwen traced a total of 3 million immigrants per year, migrants leaving China, India, and Japan, as well as those leaving Europe. He traced the eastward movement of Russians as well as their westward movement, and included the northward movement of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean settlers in Manchuria, a migrant flow halted only by World War II. Comparing McEwen's analysis of international migration with the Lucasons' more comprehensive analysis, both confirm that emigration grew greatly for Europe, while the Lucasons show that urbanization also expanded at the same time, and that temporal multi-annual migration declined in this time. But other factors intervened elsewhere. Migrations from the 1840s to 1870s especially included Chinese migrants to California and elsewhere in North America, where they had joined Chileans as early arrivals in the 1848 gold rush. White citizens of the United States, having laid claim to California in the course of the 1846 Mexican War, alternated between recruiting Chinese migrants as subordinate workers and expelling them as threats to American dominance of their newly acquired territory. McEwen then took up this issue, the study of American migration policies on the Pacific coast. He found in a complex formulation of national identity that bureaucrats replaced the idea of migrants as commodities with the idea that some migrants might qualify as free persons, persons of civilized background and able to contribute to the progress of the nation. I left out the sentence here where I mentioned that this discussion is taking place just at the end of the Civil War in the United States, and there was, for that moment, a widespread repulsion to slavery. Rather than face crude expulsion, each applicant for entry had to demonstrate an elaborate record of familial and professional excellence. Schools developed in China to prepare the applicants for dealing with the American authorities. Elaborate systems of passports and visas, inspected by a complex border bureaucracy, grew up within the USA, then among other American nations, and gradually worldwide. After the First World War, it became possible to establish restrictions on the number of persons who could enter the U.S. from any other nation. That's a massive transformation from free migration to substantial restrictions on migration and passport systems. But with the abolition of slavery and the limits on admission of overseas workers, the need for inexpensive agricultural workers became more pressing. In the 1940s, the U.S. set up separate arrangements to bring in temporary workers from the English-speaking Caribbean for the eastern United States and from Mexico for western lands. Out of these initially temporary flows developed gradually permanent settlements of West Indians and Mexicans in the eastern and western portions of the United States. This was the moment of World War II, a great global cataclysm involving huge migrations of military forces and great flows of refugees. Its migrations should be studied in more detail. The war was followed by a great restructuring of the global social order. A wave of decolonization brought national independence for Asian countries in the 1940s, for African countries in the 1960s, and then more generally. Formation of the United Nations, in part to preserve the peace among big nations, ended up doing at least as much to facilitate the relations among newly independent nations. In place of empires by the 1970s were passports and visas and statistics for nearly 200 nations. In the era since World War II, the United Nations has actively collected statistics and has steadily broadened its perspective as nationhood and social complexity have grown. The UN emphasizes international migration, thinking especially of migration to relatively rich nations. For international migration, tallies have focused on stocks of foreign-born persons by nation of residence. Here we see stocks of migrant settlers for the top 10 nations in 2000 at left, and 2015 at right shows the United States with, there it is, 47 million migrants who are 15% of the national total of 320 million as of 2015. For departures, not shown here, the largest is 15 million born in India and living elsewhere. Yet, reporting migrants as stocks in this fashion makes migratory populations look huge, as it shows accumulated numbers over an unspecified time period. Stocks of foreign-born are a one-dimensional view. Measures of flows, in contrast, give two dimensions of both origin and destination, and are also specified by duration. So recent work has given attention to migrant flows, showing them in 5-year periods with an imaginative graphic showing continents and nations of origin and destination. This graphic shows a total of 80 million migrant departures and arrivals. If you tally up the numbers of the round of this, you get to 80 million. But that means 40 million individual migrants. Each one is both leaving one place and arriving at another. At the rate of roughly 8 million per year. 8 times 5 is 40. The chart shows a major flow from Latin America to North America, really to the US, so this is a really big flow. It also shows how many migrants move from one part of Asia to another. So here's Asia. This is Asian migrants to North America, Asian migrants to Europe, but the largest migration is from one part of Asia to another. Similarly, for Africa, while there are many migrants going to Europe, the biggest migration is from one part of Africa to another. These alternative modes of presentation raise the possibility of more coherent quantification of migration. One can now observe at least 4 frameworks for documenting migration, all of which have been reformulated and improved within the last 15 years. So first is the censuses and passenger lists showing totals of emigration and immigration. McEwen upgraded this sort of display from 2000 to 2007 is when he did this work. That was a graph up there earlier. Second, cross-community migration and diaspora. So I published this framework in 2005. And for the case of the African slave trade, it links a home population, an African population, or Western African population of some 40 million, to migrant flows of up to 100,000 people a year, and to a diaspora population on the American side that expanded to 8 million. This framework is for thinking about longer periods of time and about migration from community to community. The third is the cross-cultural migration rate. This statistic designed and published by the Lucasons in 2011. It accounts for 6 categories of migration for a given territory. It's for the modern period, it's based on territorial nations or continents, and for types of migration both within and beyond national frontiers. Fourth, we have the United Nations, which has been tracing censuses since 1950, but has expanded its documentation to include urban and rural population, migrant stocks, refugee stocks, asylum seekers, and other surveys. All of these are calculated on an annual or 5-year basis, except for the Lucasons' 50-year calculation of the cross-cultural migration rate. My proposal is that we consider devising standard figures on an annual or 5-year basis, focusing on comparison or compiling of flows. As I show for global population in 2015, I haven't showed that yet. Can you move to the next one? There it is. The burst or net population gain per period can be compared to the numbers of migrants to urban areas, to international migrants, to social refugees or to refugees from ecological disaster, And these are the numbers that you get on an annual basis for the year 2015. So consider the spatial distribution of these flows. Births take place everywhere. Population growth up here centers now on tropical regions. International migrations are destined especially for wealthy countries, though we saw that can include the relatively wealthy countries within Asia or within Africa. Social refugees are concentrated especially in Western Asia and Eastern Africa, and we have only to check with the news of the day to confirm that, while ecological refugees are spread really quite widely. So Alaskan fires have their refugees. Taking inspiration from the Lucasson's cross-community migration rate, one might be able to create standard, multidimensional rates of migration as a widely recognized statistic. Gross domestic product, GDP, gives a recognized measure of output for a nation, for discrete and isolated units of society. So a measure of migration might indicate interactions within and among societies. Further, we must balance our knowledge about population trends with new knowledge about ecological trends. Summarized in this graph, showing Anthropocene growth in greenhouse gases. Right, the arrow here shows 1958 when the regular measurement of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere began to be measured. The other statistics shown here have been filled in since then. So this graph, though, enables you to see that since the 19th century, Earth's temperature has risen by 1 degree centigrade overall and may reach 2 degrees increase by 2050. That's out of the total variation that has taken place in the last few million years of 10 degrees from maximum to minimum. But these changes show why ecological refugees are already now more numerous than social refugees. Now, since I've compared various global migration rates and flows, I now offer some thoughts on future changes in population and migration. United Nations summarizes, projects, based on more than a half-century of experience, and their projections are dependable and largely credible. They show that populations are in decline in Europe and Northern Asia. Populations are still expected to increase modestly in the Americas and Oceania, especially because of immigration. Population in much of Asia, and especially Africa, will increase. India will be the most populous nation, followed by China, then by Nigeria, and then the United States as 4th largest, and Indonesia is the 5th largest country by 2050. In that year, 2050, Nigeria's population of over 400 million will have a density roughly 10 times that of the United States. And Nigeria is expected to be over 60% urban at that time. So, I'll now do a bit of introduction to the table that's before you, which is 2 speculations on world population and migration. So to clarify the complexities of projecting migration into the future, I compare 2 polar opposite sets of assumptions. First, assuming maximal reform efforts, doing everything we can to limit climate change and to reform society. That is, to restrict environmental degradation in every way, but also to seek to balance economic inequality, to limit antagonism among contending groups, and to achieve collaboration of large and small, rich and poor nations. That's the dream at one pole of this analysis. And the other pole is to assume no corrective policy for climate change or social reform. Okay, that is to say, no added or revised environmental regulation, no economic, political, or social regulation. This is the other pole, really the path on which we are currently headed. So here are my quantitative speculations. First, the table shows UN estimates for population and migration flows in 2015. This is the same table that was there before. And then in the white section, these are United Nations projections for total population and unfortunate time for that. There it goes. And for urbanization and population growth. United Nations does not project what refugee numbers will be like in the future. So then I come to my estimate for 2050. So the green is after maximum reform, and then my estimate for no reform is in gray. And the arrows here show whether the number that I've put in here is above or below the equivalent number in the first two columns. So first, I assume that total population and its growth will be less than the UN projection in both of my cases. For the case of reform, it would be because of lower tropical birth rates. So that would be planned. In the case of no reform, it would be because of higher mortality rates worldwide because of the chaos from lack of any reforms. I assume that urbanization will rise for the case of no reform because people will flee the countryside. And then I assumed that urbanization would remain as predicted for the case of reform. I assume that international migration will triple with reform because good management would help find work, yet without great social unrest through migration. But I still assume that it would increase in the case of no reform because that tropical need to find work will still be there. I assume that the number of social refugees would rise only modestly with reform because of international cooperation, but that social refugees would rise rapidly without reform because of social chaos. I assume that ecological refugees will rise in number despite reform because the temperature rise is just causing more problems, but will rise even more to become the main form of movement in the case of no reform. There are additional factors to consider when making such predictions. First, there's the reminder that these are annual rates of migratory change, and they'll be compounded, right, year after year. Second, just to think about the experience of rapid urbanization, we have the well-documented example of China, which went from 190 million urban residents in 1980 to 680 urban residents today. So, but this sort of rate of increase in urbanization is will be typical in the areas of the South. Oh wait, we're down to 10. Okay, so I'm ahead of time. International migration in Africa is mostly destined for Africa, and similarly for Asia, and so that's a factor to keep in mind. More questions. Levels of health and lifespan, will they remain the same, improve? There's been historic, dramatic improvement in lifespans. Will that continue? Well, why not? Similarly, for levels of education and professional skill. So the discrepancies in education between the countries of North and South are diminishing, and they may continue to diminish. Now, these are preliminary speculations. I don't know if these numbers are plausible. They're certainly open to critique, but I hope they show that detailed projections on future migrations and wide discussion of the projections may be helpful in setting policy and making plans. So thinking of the future also requires thinking of the past. I turn now to concluding remarks and to reviewing the main patterns and big changes in past migration in hopes of seeing which of these will be influential in the future. First, on migration and the social order. We've had a succession of larger groups and wider interconnections. I argue that speaking communities arose among humans some 70,000 years ago, and that family groups of perhaps 30 combined to form language communities of about 150. Such communities developed networks of social, intellectual, and cultural activity, enabling them to occupy the earth and its greatly varied habitats. Then by 10,000 years ago, humans supplemented foraging by creating productive societies of at least 1,000 members each. Institutions for social coordination came to include states, some of which grew steadily. With the Anthropocene, our own time, nations and language communities have risen to millions of members. Further, humans share global popular culture, global discourse, and may even achieve global consensus on key issues. The second main pattern is migration and the environment. William Redemann's projections argue that the natural ecology fluctuates autonomously, but that it also undergoes co-evolutionary change along with humanity. So this is a long-term view combining the slides from him you've seen before. Human activities have caused both rise and fall in global temperature. Redemann's graph shows change in climate and in society. A new factor today is the idea of intervening consciously to limit temperature change. Nevertheless, temperature rise is such that polar ice caps will soon disappear and they will not return. The third pattern is migration and human diversity. I emphasize the importance of diversity in achieving human development. Cross-community migration of speaking humans, in which some young people typically leave their home to join another community, is a social mechanism of diversification that adds to the existing genetic mechanisms of diversification. Cross-community migration expands genetic diversity by bringing new genetic constituents into communities which, if left isolated, might become narrowly specific through genetic drift. And cross-community migration expands social diversity by opening discussions amongst people of different backgrounds, both enabling them to exchange their existing ideas and to develop new ideas out of their interaction. Yet, migration is commonly unpleasant, dangerous, and fearsome. It facilitates human stratification. It is associated with hierarchy and inequality. The arrival of migrants in a community may raise hostilities of one sort or another, as the receiving community seeks to repel or otherwise eliminate the migrants, or as the migrants seek to conquer, oppress, or eliminate the community they enter. In a fourth pattern, migration as a means of communication. For some issues, society varies autonomously, independently of migration. For other issues, migration may influence society so that the two co-evolve. Even when migration is not a causal agent, it carries messages of change and innovation. For instance, a shift in governance from empires to nations took place for reasons other than migration, but migration spread the word about nationhood. Or migration itself may cause change. It influences both diversity and stratification, as I've argued, and in recent centuries of global migration has facilitated changes in identity. Fifth, on migration and conceptualization. Migration, quite simply, gives the migrant a new standpoint and creates new perspectives. Migration assists in thinking interactively rather than only within categories. On this last point, my arrival in Turku is changing my perspective. I moved from a self-engrossed nation of over 300 million people to a cosmopolitan and interconnected nation of 5 to 6 million, which has had an impact, had its input into American society. For links, here's Finnish Hall in Berkeley, California, built in 1932. I attended a play there in the 1970s. Conversations previous to my talk mean that I should say that the play was Waiting for Lefty by Clifford Odets. My brother lives down the street and just took the photo. This alternation between perspectives surely brings, in general, I will say that migration is socially and biologically valuable in the connections that it facilitates at various levels. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Manning, for this, I would say, a pretty bold presentation of, human mobility of the past 200,000 years, a little bit more. Anyway, so I think it was really refreshing to listen to you, and I also believed, even though I'm not an expert in global historical migrations myself, I also think that there were a few new ideas that you had collected in there. We have a couple of minutes time for questions, so would there be anyone interested in the audience to share some thoughts or ideas at this point before we launch us to lunch? Please. You can say the question and I will repeat it that everyone hears it.
Thank you very much for your very huge urbanization.
So the question was related to urbanization, and I believe in the contemporary era, mainly, probably.
And the relationship between urbanization and the situation in rural areas. And I will say at the large scale level, it's really understudied. Even the figures on urbanization that, for instance, the United Nations prepares, we're not sure to what degree those are new migrants to the urban areas and to what degree those are population increase in the urban areas. This can be sorted out, but it hasn't been prioritized because international migration has been handled much more carefully. And then only in recent years has the United Nations begun to publish their rural population areas. So this is a case where, for instance, the work that's been going on for years in Finland, where you've been paying attention to these areas, can offer leadership to people who, in other countries who do need to know the answers to these questions, and I don't have the answers.
Any more questions? We have time for one more. Okay, please.
I was just wondering, in the tables that you had ecological migrants and refugees, social refugees and international migrants. But where would you put the refugees according to the 1951 Convention?
Okay, right. So the 1951 refugees are the ones that the United Nations High Commission for Refugees pays the most attention to, and so they do report on their numbers carefully and distinguish them from others who are accounted for by the UNHCR according to the expanded, I've forgotten the date, in the 1960s when things were expanded. So you can find those numbers. I just lumped them together. But in addition, UNHCR also pays attention to the internally displaced people. So they don't have responsibility for them, but they count them carefully. Did you want to follow up a question? Or?
No, it was just in which of your three categories did you...
So I included all of those refugees with social refugees.
Okay.
All right. And the other category of what I called ecological refugees is, not that formally developed. And then new categories are being created. For instance, the category of asylum, people who are seeking asylum. The numbers are growing quite rapidly. It's not huge yet, there are overlaps. International migration and refugees are not completely discrete categories. So this is a reason why I think an effort to come up with a continuing effort to categorize and count and compare the different numbers of refugees under different groups. There'll always be debates, but we'll get some clarity out of it. So there is little public discussion of the fact that the number of people who are displaced by climate and other natural disasters is now quite a bit larger than the number who are displaced socially. But we'll get more attention to that with time.
Thank you. So let's just give a hand for Professor Manning.